everybody, and welcome to our event for today, Fiction Beyond Language, a chat with author Nguyễn Phan Quế Mai. My name is John Phan. I'm a professor of Vietnamese Humanities in the Department of East Asian Languages and Cultures, as well as the Weatherhead East Asian Institute. We're very excited for a lively conversation today about this celebrated and exciting novel. The Mountain Sing is an extraordinary novel on a number of counts, not least of which because it is written in English. In fact, it is the author's first published work, full-length in English. And despite her chosen linguistic medium, I think all of you who have read it, who are familiar with the Vietnamese language, will agree that the novel kind of vibrates with the Vietnamese language, with Vietnamese idioms, images, with even rhythms and beats of speech. More than once as a reader, and this is something that Ian and I discussed, more than once, I even heard the Vietnamese behind the English, kind of like an echo or a shadow, or a kind of richness that made the English prose feel fuller, more substantial, and more articulated. And yet there are spaces in the novel where the English prose departs entirely from Vietnamese and finds its own English-born lyricism. And in between these poles, we have a broad array of effects in which the life, color, character, and emotionality of the characters such as grandmother Diệu Lan, Mother Ngọc, and daughter Huong are rendered. And what we found very interesting is that this rendering seems to exist kind of in the space between English and Vietnamese. It's a really fascinating effect. Hence our title, Fiction Beyond Language. So this surprising, even baffling effect was the initial impetus for our meeting today. And we're so grateful to have assembled an ideal set of panelists to discuss this question of language and fiction. In addition to these issues, we hope to discuss topics ranging from intergenerationality, the traumas of the 20th century as seen through the lens of a family, Vietnamese representation and the diversity of Vietnamese viewpoints and experiences as showcased in the novel, and especially the author's process with regard to the audiences she kept in mind, the manner of rendering the rich worlds of multiple timelines of Vietnamese modern history, and her engagement with other works of literature, particularly works by authors like Myung-ok, Văn Đoàn. We hear echoes of that type of literature, especially in the protagonist of a writer coming into her own. So I'd love to hear more about that as well. So before I introduce our panelists, just one quick technical note to the audience. We'll have a lively discussion among the four panelists, I should say. And then around 10 o'clock, we will open things up to the audience. But at any point throughout the conversation, if you have a question that you'd like to pose when we turn to Q&A at 10 a.m., please do type the question into the chat box, and I will be keeping track of those questions and posing them during the Q&A. So please keep that in mind and do pose your questions when they occur to you. Okay, with that, I'd like to introduce our four panelists for today. First, Yến Vũ is a first-generation scholar of French and Vietnamese studies, focusing particularly on francophone instantiations of Vietnamese literature. She's also our current Weatherhead East Asian Institute post-doctoral fellow in Vietnamese studies. Yến obtained her PhD from Cornell in 2019, and her publications, including Phạm Huỳnh, Borrowed Language and the Ambivalence of Colonial Discourse, appeared in the Journal of Southeast Asian Studies, and Contested Kinship, Vietnamese Prodigal Sons and Ideas of Rootedness, published in Diaspora, a journal of transnational studies. She is currently finishing her first book titled Forging Freedoms, Language and Intellectual Thought in 20th Century Vietnam, which focuses on the ways in which Vietnamese intellectuals engage with language in the building of the modern nation. I also want to mention that she is co-host of the excellent podcast Nam Pham Dialogues, Casual Chats on Vietnamese History, which has received rave reviews, at least from my friends. So please do check it out as soon as you can. And she also just recently accepted a professorship at Fulbright University in Ho Chi Minh City. And we will all miss her here and wish her the very best in her new endeavor. Next up is Marie Myung-ok, who is a scholar of Korean and Asian American literature, a celebrated novelist, core faculty, and writer in residence at the Center for the Study of Ethnicity and Race here at Columbia. She is the acclaimed author of the novel Somebody's Daughter, as well as several works of young adult fiction, including Finding My Voice, 1992, which earned Lee the Best Book for Reluctant Readers Award from the American Library Association. She is the author of If It Hadn't Been for Yoon Chun, in 1993, and Necessary Roughness in 1996, all works of young adult fiction. In fact, Lee has consistently been praised as a pioneer in Asian American literary representation in young adult fiction, and Finding My Voice was described as one of the first works to center contemporary Asian Americans in young adult fiction. Lee's works have been featured in a wide variety of publications, including The Atlantic, the Kenyon Review, The Guardian, and the New York Times. In addition, Lee is the founder of the Asian American Writers Workshop and was an Our Word writer in residence for the Columbia MFA program. Finally, her forthcoming novel, entitled The Evening Hero, spans rural hospital closures, immigration, and the Korean War, and we look very much forward to that. Finally, I'd like to introduce our guest of honor today, author Nguyễn Phan Quế Mai. Our guest of honor was born in Ninh before emigrating south to Bạc Liêu in the Mekong Delta at a young age. She attended undergraduate studies at Monash University in Australia before going on to complete a master's and doctoral work in creative writing at Lancaster University. Quế Mai is the award-winning author of 11 books of poetry, fiction, and nonfiction, including Trái Cấm, Forbidden Fruit, Những bí mật của hoa sen, The Secret of Hoa Sen or The Secret of the Lotus, and Tổ quốc gọi tên mình, Our Nation Calls My Name, which was turned into a popular song by the musician Đinh Trung Cẩn in 2011. Her accolades include the 2010 Poetry of the Year Award from the Hanoi Writers Association, the Capital's Literary and Arts Award, and the Vietnam Writers Association Award for Outstanding Contribution to the Advancement of Vietnamese Literature Overseas. Her debut novel and first work in English, which is the topic for today, is entitled The Mountains Sing, and was runner-up for the 2021 Dayton Literary Peace Prize, and was the winner of the 2020 Book Browse Best Debut Award, winner of the 2021 International Book Award, and winner of the 2020 Lannan Literary Award Fellowship for a work of exceptional quality, among several other recognitions. In addition to her writing, Nguyễn Phan Quế Mai also founded Chắp cánh ước mơ, or Dream Wings, Wings of a Dream, a voluntary group to support children living with cancer, as well as 2 scholarship programs for disadvantaged Vietnamese children, and is also an author advocate for Room to Read, a global nonprofit dedicated to improving literacy and gender equality worldwide. She has been named by Forbes Vietnam as one of the 20 inspiring women of 2021. And I do want to mention that her forthcoming novel, to be published, I just learned, this coming March, is entitled Just Dust Child. So we hope that she'll come back to discuss that book as well. So at this point, I'd like to turn things over to Quế Mai, who will kick off our discussion about her celebrated novel, The Mountains Sing.
Thank you so much, John, for your great introduction. Hello, everyone. It's my great honor to be here. It was my dream to study at Columbia University, and so I can't believe it that I'm here discussing my novel. I would like to thank John, Julie, who's taking care of all the technical issues today. Ian, I'm so honored to be speaking with you, and Marie, you cut short your trip to promote your forthcoming book to be home to have this discussion. I'm so honored. I look forward to The Evening Hero, the new novel of Marie, and I hope you will check it out as well. And thank you so much to so many of you who are joining us today. So I'm speaking with you from Vietnam, from Hội An, and I stay in a village and surrounded by golden rice fields. It's the rice harvest season at the moment, and I grew up growing rice, and I think I wrote this novel as a rice farmer. If you read the novel, I hope you will notice that I incorporate many stages of growing rice, because rice farming is really the pillar of the Vietnamese life, I wrote in my second novel that being a rice farmer is being an artist. You create seasons of colors, because if you watch a rice field, you can see the changes in the colors. So anyway, I just want to share with you my joy of being at home and being surrounded by nature, and seeing how hard Vietnamese work. I was up this morning at 5 o'clock, and I was cycling around, and I saw people up and working, and everyone is looking forward to the future, working really hard, and there's a lot of positive energy here. So maybe I can start this conversation by giving a short reading of my novel. This passage comes from page 69. And it is in the voice of Hương, one of the two women who tells the family, the history of the Chan family. So Hương parents have gone to war, and she's yearning for them, and this is her. This is what she's thinking to herself. During the years that she was gone, I imagined seeing my mother again every day. I imagined disappearing into her embrace, into the river of her hair, into her soft breast. I imagined our voices rising like kites from under the shade of our new bang tree. By the beginning of 1975, rumors spread that the war was really ending, and I imagined my mother flying me down the streets of Hanoi on the back of grandma's bicycle. We could scream at the top of our lungs as the bike rushed us into a brilliant summer, into red flowers, into purple bang lang petals that blossomed above pavements punctured by bomb shelters. We could stop at the leg of the returned sword, delighting in the delirious coldness of Chang Tien's ice cream. In my dreams, my mother always returned with my father. He was tall and handsome. Sometimes he would rush toward me on his 2 feet. Sometimes he struggled on a single leg, leaning on a crutch. Sometimes he embraced me with his 2 strong arms, and at other times he had no arms at all, just 2 lumps of soft flesh protruding from his shoulders. But he always laughed as he called my name. Here is Hương, my daughter. So as you could notice from this passage, there are Vietnamese words that I did not translate. It was my purpose to invite the readers into the Vietnamese culture, Vietnamese history, into Vietnamese language, not just with their mind, but with their hearts. I want people to open their hearts and receive Vietnam, not with their full understanding, but with their emotions and feelings. And I think because normally, as a Vietnamese writer, when our work is published in English, we are normally asked to change our language to please the eyes and ears of Western readers. For example, the Vietnamese language, normally when published as part of the Western text, the diacritical marks are removed. And I feel like we need to write to serve the Western readers, because we have to change our language. Because, for those who know Vietnamese language, you will see that the tonal marks are so important. They give meaning to each word. For example, the word ma, without any tonal mark or diacritic, it means a ghost. With a sak, it means ma means mother, ma means young rice plant, ma means a grave, ma means a horse, ma means butt. So there's just so many meanings associated with one single word, thanks to the diacritical marks. So I asked my publisher to please, protect the Vietnamese language by preserving these tonal marks, even though, I knew it could be, my novel could be, more, less popular, because nobody, most readers don't remember my name. But I am willing to make that sacrifice, because I feel like, Vietnam and Vietnamese language have suffered so much due to colonization. And I want to decolonize literature in English about Vietnam by protecting, our language by inserting Vietnamese language into English, because our ways of expressions, also the rhythm of the language, like John mentioned before. I think one way for me to also decolonize literature in English about Vietnam is also to put Vietnamese stories in the center stage. So even though this novel is set in the back, against the backdrop of the Vietnam War, it was my intention not to give Americans any speaking role. Because, in most literature in English about Vietnam, or, written in the point of view of Westerners, or in Hollywood movies, Vietnamese people normally don't have any speaking role. We act as background to the Western stories. So I want to write against that. I want to put, Vietnamese issues in the center stage, because the Vietnamese community still needs a lot of healing and reconciliation. If you live in the States, you may have met Vietnamese Americans who refuse to go back to Vietnam. I know quite a few people of the older generation who prohibit their children to go back to Vietnam because they think they lost their country. We have a lot of issues to work through as a Vietnamese community, and I want to highlight these issues in my book, because I think forgiveness is so difficult when it comes to family members, because Vietnamese did a lot of bad things to each other during the Vietnam War and throughout our history, as I have shown in my novel. So to forgive and forget is easier to apply when it comes to foreigners, That's why reconciliation between Vietnam and the US has made tremendous progress. But among the Vietnamese community ourselves is so difficult. So I don't want to speak too much, even though, I can speak for hours about my book. It took me 7 years to write. I need to tell you that it was very difficult, and my husband told me this novel is going to kill you because there were so many nights I did not sleep. I did not sleep because the characters was calling out to me when I was sleeping, and they told me, get up and write. Our stories cannot sleep until you tell them. I interviewed, hundreds of people for this book, and their tears, their emotions really gave me fire. This is a fictional account of Vietnamese history, but it's based on so many real life experiences. Yeah, so I look forward very much to the conversation today. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for those comments, Quế Mai. I prepared my remarks independently of having heard anything that you had mentioned, and we've touched so many things that I want to say are in line with what you've mentioned, and I think that's just a testament to how well you conveyed those ideas throughout your text. So I am really approaching this conversation and this novel in my capacity as a researcher of Vietnamese francophone literature and of the 20th century Vietnamese history, studying literature that's written in a language that's not one's own, as well as a Vietnamese American of a younger generation. So I'm bringing both my personal and professional lens to this. And I feel, as a Vietnamese American who speaks both Vietnamese and English, I am in this very privileged position to read this novel. And so much of it has to do with the translation aspects that you've mentioned, and I hope that we'll be able to talk further about, where I have access to meaning sooner than, let's say, just an English-speaking reader would have. And I think that makes my reading experience very, very special, and in line with what John was saying earlier about how you just hear the Vietnamese vibrating in the English words. I think it describes why this experience is so unique. And there was a study that was done for Vietnamese francophone novels, Vietnamese novels written in French, by a scholar named Jack Yeager, and this was in the 1980s. And he was talking about literature as this response to colonialism, which is a very specific experience and condition for Vietnamese literature. But I think this work was pointing and orienting a larger question about where we put this literature. And so just in the same way that French literature needs to make room and American literature needs to make room for ethnic literature written in their language, I also think that the Vietnamese literature realm needs to make room for these works, these Vietnamese works written in other languages. And perhaps this also touches upon the reconciliation aspect that you mentioned. But for the Vietnamese Francophone writers that I study, there's often a preface that says, I'm writing in a language that's not my own and it's not perfect. But the point is, I have a story to tell. And I think that's the same kind of phenomenon that we see here. And I see that also in the recognizable elements of Vietnamese culture that is represented in America or in the English language, for example, the rice fields or the bowls of pho. Like, these are cultural icons that we know of as Americans. But I think what your novel does so well is to peel back that superficial layer and really get into the deeper struggles, the deeper things that we grapple with as a Vietnamese people. And I have to say that I think, and this is the last comment, I think this text is extremely of the times, as in it's so contemporary precisely because of this question of reconciliation that you mentioned. We see that at the end of the novel, how because this Vietnamese story was told through a family history, reconciliation extremely hard. You know, it's really hard to not only to forgive someone that you trusted, that is in your family, that you would expect to be by your side. And the point, though, and I think this comes through very well, is that reconciliation is not perfect. Even when at the end of the story, the family is reunited, there are members who are missing. There are members who don't come to terms with everything, who are still grappling with some of their own internal struggles, but they're together. And I think that is why this novel is so contemporary and so important for all of us to read, especially as both Vietnamese and Vietnamese Americans.
Thank you for that. That was really interesting. Thank you for that beautiful reading. I'm also it's impossible not to approach this both personally and sort of professionally and scholarly. It's impossible to, I was telling Quế Mai that I was, not only, this book has an amazing cover, by the way, that I just admire so much. I had read the book a while ago and I was reading it again on the plane. I was one of the few masked people, and even just reading it again, just the ending, I started crying into my mask. And Quế Mai, when you start reading again, I just started feeling all emotional again. And it's obvious that the accretion of the details, and as someone who does not speak the Vietnamese language, I still like fall into that language every time I read it again. Like I would read all the stuff with the diacritics, and I just do feel like there was some kind of like absorption, almost like saturation. It is like a saturation, because as soon as you start reading again, I started tearing up again. And those words were not new to me. And I agree that this book isn't completely contemporary, because it's impossible as an Asian American, as an Asian person, to see, not as if, we're comparing like oppression, but it's impossible to see the treatment of the war in Ukraine with this kind of skipping of all these wars of empire that the US has done in Asia. And similarly, I've been thinking too about, for Americans, including people like me, the way that the Vietnam War has been mediated in culture has been through the Ken Burns documentary. And for someone like that, despite, you know, his professed like really good intentions, it as you say, completely decenters the Vietnamese people, and then the Vietnamese people become props. And there's never ever, despite what he is putatively trying to do, there's never an invitation for the viewer to enter into Vietnamese life. So I have like a million questions for you. And one of the things, before I go to the bigger questions, I guess, is as a writer, it's so interesting to me because you started out as a poet. And so with that kind of like, attachment to language, But then the idea that I would love for you to speak about how your transition to English, and it's not technically that well, it is kind of the colonizer's language. Like, so I just want to hear about that transition, because you write so beautifully in English, and I can't imagine writing another language like that.
Thank you so much, Mary. You are so kind, and thank you, Ian. Your comments are just so invaluable to me as a Vietnamese and as a writer. To answer Mary's question, so actually, a lot of Vietnamese are poets. We have, I quoted poet Phùng Quán in The Mountain Sing, and he's one of the most, well-known poets of Vietnam, and he has this verse: có những phút ngã lòng tôi viện câu thơ và đứng dậy. During moments of difficulty, I hold on to the verse of poetry to pull myself up. So poetry is there for us to gain strength, to give us strength. So, I listened to poetry growing up, from public radio broadcast. Poetry was read to me every day, and I grew up, writing poetry in my diaries. I wrote diaries in poetry, and I learned a lot of poetry by heart, and naturally I started my writing career with poetry, and then one day I had the idea of writing a novel so that more people would read my poetry. That's one of the reasons why I switched to the novel. But another reason is that, for years I was translating poetry because I wanted the international readers to know about the beauty of the Vietnamese language and of how special Vietnamese literature is, and to know Vietnam more than the war. So I translated a lot of Vietnamese poetry, and one day I was thinking I should translate an epic novel because I wanted, to present Vietnam beyond the war, and also Vietnam as a country, Vietnam as a culture. And I was looking for that novel, and then one day I thought, why don't I write it myself to save myself years of translating it? And actually translating literature is really hard. Sometimes it's harder than writing it because, in translating literature, you give life to a work of literature. You give life to it, but you have to create within certain boundaries, the boundaries of the original work. Whereas if you write it to yourself, you have more freedom. So I started this crazy venture of writing in English, and it was most insane because I only, I grew up in the countryside of Vietnam. My schools did not have any English teacher. So I got to learn English the first time when I was in the 8th grade, and not through a formal school system, through a teacher who came and give free English lessons to poor kids. So I really only got the chance to learn English properly when I was, when I was about 19 years old, when I went to Australia, thanks to a scholarship. So, I didn't read literature in English, so I had a lot to catch up on. So I wrote this novel with a dictionary and with the determination to write it as a Vietnamese, because there was no way I could write it like a native English speaker. So that's why, one of my PhD research questions is how to write in English with the Vietnamese essence. So my characters would be conveying themselves in English through the novel, but they would be thinking and acting and in the Vietnamese way. So that's why, I have a lot of proverbs in the novel, because proverbs are like the pillars of Vietnamese life. If I have a bad day, I come home and I complain, and my mom would say, trong cái rủi có cái may, good luck hides inside bad luck. And I would feel a lot better. So if you talk to a Vietnamese person, you will immediately hear proverbs. And I had to include that into the novel, for example. Yeah, so I think, being a poet helps me quite a bit when I became a novelist, because like I I knew how to dig deeper into the language to find different layers, but also to kind of condense certain things into images and use images and rhythms to convey certain things. So so sometimes, you know, it took me the whole day just to polish 1 or 2 sentences because I wanted to be poetic. And it was a crazy task because, you know, I'm not fluent in English at all.
You are very fluent in English.
I am still learning English every day. I have a notebook and I am noting, you know, I'm learning by reading. I'm reading every day and I note down new words that I need to, you know, memorize.
I love that. I love that it's still a process. And even with Vietnamese, I grew up speaking it, but I'm still learning so much. And I learned so much actually through your book and through all of these proverbs that you mentioned. I love how every moment where one of the characters gets discouraged or encounters an obstacle, there's a proverb that actually is precisely that cane with which she stands up. So it's exactly as you say. And you know, the experience of having a bad day and then going to my mother, she pulls one out of her pocket, and it just really speaks to how for the Vietnamese, poetry is very accessible. It's not this highbrow, not this inaccessible elitist thing. It's something that percolates into everyday life and culture. And with your mention of the epic poem that you were searching, you know, when you say that this is a Vietnamese novel in English, I sense that so well, so much. And precisely because Diệu Lan is kind of like a modern day incarnation of Kieu, and all of the trials and, you know, all of the struggles she goes through, yet somehow she always emerges and makes the best of the situation. So when I was reading this, I was like, this is a Vietnamese novel. I just happened to be reading the English words. But even as a Vietnamese speaker and an English speaker, I think I took that for granted. I was like, this is just a Vietnamese novel. I didn't even think about that difference. So very much in line with what you're saying.
So I have a quick language question that'll hopefully like bleed into the rest of the discussion, because so earlier, you know, I was talking about like the US's war on empire and how we see you know, for instance, the nomenclature that we use for foreign wars, particularly in Asia, there's Korean War, Vietnam War, war in Iraq, war in Afghanistan, war on terror. I'm just curious, so in Vietnamese language, how is the war referred to and what is it called?
So in Vietnam, the official name of the war is called Chiến tranh chống Mỹ cứu nước, the resistance war against America to save the nation. So you know, or people would say Chiến tranh chống Mỹ, the resistance war against America. So I mean, you know, the name of the war itself is difficult among Vietnamese people as well, you know, because like if we say Chiến tranh chống Mỹ cứu nước, the resistance war against America, we ignore the Southern Vietnamese Republic, you know, in the south of Vietnam, who fought, you know, against North. So you know, that's why to keep it neutral, I call it the Vietnam War. And so you know, it's something quite sensitive and quite difficult to determine.
Because in Korea, I was thinking people just call it the war, or it's called 625. And it made me think of, oh, right, we call it 9/11. Like Koreans aren't going to call it the Korean War. Do you know what I'm saying? So it just, that helped me like kind of realize how much, like as an American, my whole like language has been centralized by, oh, you know, the US is America's policeman. And that's how we look at these wars versus the devastation that has happened to ordinary people who just want to get on with their lives and don't consider themselves necessarily to have sides.
I wish we could call it the war too, but I think because Vietnam went through so many wars. You know, first we had to fight against the French, you know, the Chinese, the Mongolians, you know, the Japanese, the French. You know, we had the war against Cambodia, you know, against China as well recently. So, you know, there have been too many wars, so it's very difficult for us to give names.
If I can jump in on just the issue that Maria raised about translation again, there is a question from the audience that I think it's good time to insert it just because it's relevant. So we have an anonymous question just generally about your process, about how you decided when to translate and when not. And I just want to tack on a question because on your, and I apologize if this is inaccurate, but on your Vietnamese Wikipedia, the translation of the mountain sing is something like những ngọt núi, ngân vang, like the reverberating mountain, right? So it's not Sun Ca, which is like the swallow, the mountain swallow, which is the literal thing that you translate as the mountain sing in the novel. So I'm just curious, in addition to when and how when you decided to translate, how you translate it, because it's not always literal, it's not always straightforward. You know, you make choices there. So I'd love to hear
thank you. Thank you for this great question. I think, you know, like I said, I wrote this novel not just with my mind, but with my heart. And sometimes my heart tell me, you know, sometimes my heart told me, let the reader feel this instead of understand this, you know. So I could describe the emotions, I would invite. Sometimes I felt the need to have the Vietnamese there, and especially, you know, for the names of certain trees and flowers. If I translated it, it could sound really technical, scientific, you know. So for example, for my, you know, I just finished editing my second novel, Dust Child. So I debated on the name of the phượng tree a lot with my editor. So, you know, I translated it as the flamboyant tree. And she said this name is not common. And we discussed and we decided to keep the original, you know, Vietnamese, like the original version as I submitted to her a while ago, to have it as the phượng tree, because I described the flowers there already. So I think the reader would know what type of tree it is. Yeah, so you know, regarding the name of the novel, actually, it's also, there's a debate going on in Vietnam. There are readers who read it and translate it differently, because like the name, the mountain sing, I intend, there were several reasons why I chose that name. The mountain sing is the translation of the bird's name, Sơn Ca. Sơn Ca means the mountains sing, but the mountains also represent the challenges faced by Vietnamese people throughout our history. Like Grandma Diệu Lan Thâu Hương, the challenges faced by Vietnamese people are as tall as the tallest mountains. And in the end of the novel, Grandma Diệu Lan became the tallest mountain for Hương. She was the mountain who was always there, always protecting her family. So you know, I think the mountains also represent the Trường Sơn mountain ranges, where Uncle Dad had to go through to be able to reach the south. So you know, there are images of the mountains, and the singing represents, you know, resilience or courage or bravery. So I don't know, I embedded so many things into the title, so it's hard to translate.
And I think that really goes to the point about words are not perfect and language is not perfect, but there's always a negotiation. And even when I was reading you generally translate the proverbs pretty soon after you use them in the book. And so generally, if you don't speak Vietnamese, you can soon have access to the meaning of those proverbs. But there's one inscription that you don't translate right away, and that's the inscription at the bottom of the wooden bird that Hương receives from her father, not directly, but through Uncle Dad. And as a Vietnamese speaker, I knew what the word what the saying was. It was so I think the inscription is con gái là máu nóng trong tim cha, and it's a beautiful inscription. And I was reading, and it took me maybe 3-4 lines down, and I was like, oh, the author didn't provide an English translation. And I wondered if you were going to, and it took a few more pages before you actually did. And this kind of withholding of the meaning was very interesting for me. And then another point of negotiation for me as a reader, there was a proverb that you had used called lửa thử vàng, gian nan thử sức, which translates to fire tests gold and adversity tests men. But for me, when I read suk, I thought, oh, that should be strength. And I think the point there, though, is that there isn't necessarily a perfect translation, because the meaning still kind of still holds. But I think it really goes to speak about how in that negotiation process, me thinking it means strength and you writing adversity tests men, that there's an expansion of what the words can mean. Like there's spatially, these words could mean multiple things. And I think that's something that's very unique, particularly in this book, because you're working through writing it in Vietnamese, but also writing it in English. You're working through translation as you're writing the book. And I think that comes through as a reader, that there are these multiple meanings and that we don't necessarily have to sit with just one.
Yeah, thank you for that comment. When it came to Proverbs, it took me a lot of time to translate. Sometimes it took me months to translate one particular proverb. For example, I wanted to protect the images in the Vietnamese language when it comes to the translation. For example, there's this proverb in the book, con nhà tông không giống lông cũng giống cánh. So a lot of people, when they translate that proverb into English, they could translate, the equivalent of the English proverb, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, right? But, the Vietnamese proverb says, it's so beautiful. So it took me months to come up with this translation with the help of two of my poet friends, Paul Christensen and Thanh Hà Lai. So we translated it as family members, if not related in feather, then in wings. So that really, that is also the literal translation of the Vietnamese proverb, con nhà tông không giống lông cũng giống cánh. Family members, if not related in feathers, then in wings. Yeah, so I learned a lot when translating. Actually, I learned about the layers of the language and how to play with different things. But but also sometimes you have to make choices, and translation is never a perfect task, like you said.
Well, I really love how you kind of situate your idea of protecting the Vietnamese language and culture in this book. But as a fellow writer, I know how difficult getting published is, and the idea that books are a consumer commodity that need to be sold. So you try to make it easier to sell and read. So I'm just really curious about your journey trying to sell a book, publishing. Have you gotten pushback from editors and readers? I'm just so curious, because I don't think it could have been very easy. Even, I know you're very committed to that, and that's really inspiring for me to even just hear that.
Thank you so much. So,
if I can just tack on to the end of that, what that would look like in Vietnam, because this is also abroad.
Hương said in the novel, if I were to become a writer, I would not bend my pen to please the eyes and ears of those in power. And I feel like as a writer, I would not, I established this mission to write with honesty so that I do not obey to those who have political power or power in literature. As a minority writer, I did not want to write to serve the Western readers, for the purpose of selling my book, for example. So I'm really I mean, this novel got a lot of rejections. You know, my agent tried to. It took me years to find an agent, and then my agent sold it really quickly, but we got many rejections. There were a few editors who were interested in the novel, and I decided to accept the offer from Betsy Gleich, who's like the editor from Algonquin Books, because she's the one who gave me a phone call. She wanted to call me before she bought the book. She wanted to talk to me to find out who I am as a writer, and to discuss, to talk about my mission as a writer and her idea for editing. And I'm really glad to be working with her, because she has really respect. She has high respect for Vietnamese culture. So she accepted my idea to have the critical marks, even in my names, my name, to keep it very long instead of abbreviating it to the usual, 2-word name. I keep it as 4 words, And so Betsy was great to work with, but the copy editor wanted to me to keep Vietnam as 1 word, Saigon as 1 word, like in the English way, and Hanoi as 1 word. And I said, no, I wanted this novel to be a Vietnamese novel. I wanted all the language of Vietnam to be Vietnamese. So I had a discussion with the copy editor about that. Yes, I think sometimes as a writer, you have to stand firm. And I think if you can explain your reasons, I think, your team would support it. And I think sometimes I also call on other writers to support me as well. So I reached out to other writers and I said, what did you do in this situation? So we are in a community, I'm really lucky to be supported by writers such as Ocean Vuong and Viet Thanh Nguyen and Thi Bui, who are brilliant Vietnamese American writers. And they inspire me a lot, with their courage and with their creativity.
So we do have one more question. Since we're in this topic of translation still a little bit, we have a kind of interesting thought experiment for you from Ben Roast in the audience. He asks, I'm going to paraphrase, but he asks in so many words, what do you imagine the novel would have been like had you written it in Vietnamese? How would it have been different? And does writing it in English change your relationship, say, to the characters you created?
Thank you so much. I think if I were to write this novel in Vietnamese, I would censor myself. Censorship is a big issue in Vietnam. For example, The Sympathizer by Viet Thanh Nguyen, which won the Pulitzer Prize, which has been published in so many languages, is not published in Vietnam due to censorship. And any Vietnamese writer, when we write, we need to think whether our work would put us and our family into trouble, or whether it could be withdrawn from the market or prohibited. So I wanted to have freedom when I write this book, because it deals with sensitive parts of Vietnamese history, parts which include the land reform, which we are not talking about publicly here. So I wrote in English to give myself the freedom of expression, but also to step away a little bit from the personal pain that my family experienced. For example, I am not sure I would be able to write about the Great Hunger of 1945, because I lost 3 family members to that horrific event. And I mean, to describe, somehow, describing it in English, I protected myself a little bit, because English is not my mother tongue, right? And I can give you another example. The most difficult part in the novel concerns the diary entries of Dr. Ngọc. She returned from the battlefield really traumatized. And it was so hard for me to write those diary entries, I tried for months and they did not feel right. So until one day, I put away everything I have written for that part, and I started a diary entry in Vietnamese. And I wrote, Anh ơi. Anh ơi is like my beloved, you know, a wife calls the husband my beloved. And I started writing it in Vietnamese, and it felt so close to my heart. It felt as if I was, you know, Dr. Ngọc. I was crying, I was sobbing, and, you know, and after half an hour of writing, I knew the emotions was right. So I switched to English. And those are the entries that you see in the book. So sometimes I needed Vietnamese to open the key, to be the key to open certain doors. But in a lot of cases, you know, for example, to write about the land reform was really tough, because what Grandma Diệu Lan went through actually happened to the grandma of my friend, who had to abandon one child after the next, you know, during the land reform, to be able to save them. And as a mother, to write about that, it was so difficult for me. And I think to write it in English made it a little easier. Not too easy, but a little easier. So I don't know, but I write in both languages, you know. Sometimes I'm really homesick, especially, you know, during, for example, the last Vietnamese New Year, I wasn't able to return home because of COVID. So Vietnam closed its border. There was no flight. I was so homesick. So I wrote in Vietnamese, and it was so, I needed it. I felt like when I wrote about Vietnam, or I wrote in Vietnamese, I could heal myself, because, you know, being a Vietnamese and being away from home, I felt like a part of me is missing, you know, a part of me is broken somehow. So I heal myself by writing in Vietnamese, by writing about Vietnam.
It's really fascinating, the idea that English was a kind of protective distance. It's really interesting, and I can see, I mean, this is something that I think I've spoken with Ian about. You know, I chose pre-modern Vietnamese literature as a field, like, you know, 500, 600, even my dissertation's on 1,000 years ago, as a kind of distance as well from the pain of the 20th century. So I can relate to that idea. Unless one of the panelists has a comment, I would like to pivot to something that all three of you, in fact, have raised at a certain point. The issue of reconciliation, and the issue of how it's harder with family, family both in the literal sense and family in the sense of the family of a nation. And the idea of the story that's told through these three generations of the Chen family particularly. And, you know, it's something I think Marie's novels have worked with struggles. You know, her first novel works with an adoptee. So there's an issue of family there in a completely separate sense. And of course, Ian, you commented on the issue of reconciliation in your comments earlier. So I'd like to hear, if possible, all three of you, beginning perhaps with Quế Mai, speak a little bit about family as a lens through which this trauma is experienced, and reconciliation as a particularly difficult task when there's an intimate bond of love like that.
You know, I experienced the pain of reconciliation in my own family. I have two uncles who fought in the Vietnam War, one for the North and one for the South. And my parents are from the North, and they did not tell me about my uncle in the South, whom they consider a traitor. So he actually died in the war, and I only got to know his family when I was, you know, more than 20 years old. So, you know, growing up in Vietnam, I considered people like him a traitor too, you know. So in Vietnamese textbooks, I learned certain things about people who fought for the Southern Vietnamese army. But in talking to his family, I learned that my uncle loved to sing and dance, and he was a great person. And it, you know, I felt like, you know, in times of war, we dehumanize the other side, you know. So literature is important to reclaim the humanity for people of all sides. That's why, you know, even though, you know, American characters, you know, appear very briefly in the Mountain Sing, but I want to portray their human characters as well. And I want, you know, my uncle's experiences inspired me to write the character Uncle Ming, because I wanted to get to know my uncle intimately by writing about Uncle Ming. And, you know, there's a legend that all Vietnamese belong to a family. We all children of Myung-ok, Oko Fairy and the dragon law Lạc Long Quân. And, you know, and I think it's very painful to know that we have done terrible things to each other throughout our history, and we cannot reconcile because we don't have chances to talk about it. You know, there have been no forum when we openly talk about reconciliations and what we must do to bring our community together, and how we need to help each other heal so that the trauma is not inherited by the younger generations. So I think it's really important, and it's long overdue that we have such conversations to talk frankly about reconciliations and how we can move on and how we can work together to help each other heal. So yeah, so you know, this is something that needs to be done. It still takes many years, I think, and it's a very challenging task.
I think in the novel, one of the most moving pieces was there's a kind of horrible character in the land reform that's in the earlier part of the novel, and at the end, Jilan, the grandmother, encounters her again. And the idea of the Western narrative would be so much about catharsis and get what's coming to you, or like action. But it was really, to me, I'm Buddhist. It was such a kind of Buddhist moment. So I'm not going to give away the spoilers. I just want to talk about how that moment was one of these things where narratively, it should have, the energy that was generated in the novel should have gone a certain way to catharsis. If we look at it through the Western lens, that because you took it a different way, there was a certain opening up of a certain kind of reparation or redemption that I wasn't expecting. And it ended up being like more satisfying to me, despite the fact that it didn't follow the usual narrative trajectory. So I just love the idea of this, the kind of like spiritual and emotional world that you made that didn't follow the normal narrative trajectory that we look for as readers and as writers. And that's how I feel like this book becomes a much larger kind of idea of reconciliation. And then how can we think of it this way?
Thank you so much. I think you were talking about the character Wicked Ghost, right? In the novel, actually, I made up his character to take revenge. I invented him from my father's story. My father told me that his own mother was killed by a man in the Great Hunger of 1945. So actually during the Great Hunger, my father and his sister were really hungry, and my grandma ventured into a cornfield to try to steal corn for her very hungry children. And the guard of that cornfield caught her and tied her to the corn plants. And she was too weak to break away. So she died there on the cornfield, and later two of my family members died too. And I was really angry at that man who came from our village. And my father said, after the Great Hunger, he moved away. So I imagined his character, and I wanted to do terrible things to him, because with fiction, you can do whatever you want, right? But actually, I found out that I'm not a violent person. Like Grandma Ziolan said in the novel, if you bear grudges, you are the one who has to bear the burden of sorrow. So I found out that the gift of forgiveness. And I really think, unless we forgive each other, the cycle of violence will never stop. So I learned so much about myself via this book. I learned about the value of forgiveness, the value of reconciliation via this book.
And to add, I think one of the elements that makes this reconciliation possible for grandmother Lan is that there's a generational distance too. So the effects, I recall that grandmother Lan said, you know, I don't want to give away the ending, but the people involved in the reconciliation were not involved in the violent acts. And so therefore, they shouldn't be implicated in the same way. And I think that is such a good analogy for the reconciliation that might happen today. And this is why I said in the very beginning, early remarks, that this book was so contemporary, was that it really took in all of the different perspectives of the Vietnamese experience. And there's no one bad guy. There's no one experience that's antagonized, which was very counter to my experience. My family grew, well, my parents lived in the South and was part of the wave of people who came to America. And so just a side actually anecdote, John had mentioned that I'm going to Vietnam for this Fulbright position next year. I actually had to write a whole letter to my parents to explain why this was a good decision for me. And it was really hard to articulate that I wanted this reconciliation to happen through my own exploration. And it was really, I think I felt like I was betraying my parents because, you know, I was undoing this narrative that they had about North Vietnam and about Vietnam in general and how it's moved on from their lives. You know, the Vietnam that is now is so different from the Vietnam they knew 20, 30, 40 years ago. And so to initiate that and to tell my parents, this is something we need to do to open up the way that we see Vietnam and to give the youth an experience for themselves. This is the only way that we can move on from some of this inherited trauma that, well, firsthand trauma, but then also inherited trauma that later generations will have. So for me, this moment was just, it touched at a very tender part for me.
Thank you, Yến, for sharing your experiences. I'm so proud of you. I'm so proud you wrote this letter to your parents. I really hope they will come back to Vietnam with you and stay with you. You know, I just had a podcast with the Vietnamese podcast. You know, I had a conversation with Cô Lệ Lý, who wrote the memoir When Heaven and Earth Change Places, and we talk about reconciliation. And you know, and I told the listeners that Vietnam is there for everyone. You know, no one can have the right to take away your homeland. Vietnam is there regardless of the political system, you know. So I'm here back in Vietnam and it's so beautiful and so special. I think you will have a great time in Vietnam, and I really hope your parents will return with you, at least for a short visit, and it will help heal them as well. I think the returning trip will heal a lot of people.
On this, staying on this question of forgiveness, I want to get to another anonymous attendee's question, but I also wanted to preface it by the observation that, you know, it was interesting to me that you have Uncle Ming, the Catholic, he makes the remark, forgiveness is so hard, you know, but Diệu Lan is the one who kind of expresses that in her actions, as Marie pointed out, not only with Wicked Ghost, but with, I forgot, looks like a rabbit. You know, and I don't remember exactly where in the novel, but you specifically use the term Nhan, which is, it's usually translated as endure or bear, you know, but bear not only, you know, transgressions against you, but bear also in the sense of bear the connection with another human, another sentient being, you know, in Buddhism. So, you know, there is a kind of undercurrent of religious, I mean, or philosophical sort of forgiveness that runs through the story, which was fascinating. So I'd love to hear you talk about how you wove that together, or the choices you made between those two religions. And on a related note to this discussion in general, back to Ian's point, and we have a question kind of about reception, actually, but on this note. So an anonymous attendee asks, how was humanizing different sides viewed by different readers of your book? So I see this as a reception question. You know, forgiveness is hard. So do you see your readers, you know, sort of accepting the message, you know, or did you think about that when you wrote your novel, when you fashioned the novel to carry this kind of very difficult, demanding kind of message?
Actually, you know, I did not have a plan for the novel when I wrote it. I discovered many things in the process of writing it. I discovered my values, my beliefs, my appreciation for peace, my appreciation for human kindness when I wrote this book. So, you know, in the end, things just came together, and I feel like I have my ancestors' blessings when I wrote this. And, you know, I must tell you, as a Vietnamese, it's really tricky to write an account which is acceptable by all sides, right? Because Vietnamese history is very complex, and people just have that, you know, very different experiences. So you know, there are a lot of you know, viewpoints. So, you know, I was also quite nervous when the novel was released, because I remember a few years ago, I went to Los Angeles, and I was going to have a meeting with a poet in Orange County. And he said before the meeting, he got many phone calls of people telling him not to meet me because I'm communist, because, you know, my work is widely published in Vietnam. So I remember the first public reading I had, it was in San Jose, and that night I dreamed that there would be a demonstration outside the venue, because I heard so many stories from Vietnamese writers that there were demonstrations at their readings. But I was just so amazed by the reception of the Vietnamese community in the US. You know, for example, in Los Angeles, recently when I was there, the Vietnamese community, you know, like did a fundraising, did an event to welcome me, and they cooked food, they donated products, and we laughed and cried together. And in Vietnam here, you know, there are just so many readers who reach out to me, and they said, you know, I never knew what happened to my family, and by reading this book I could ask my parents questions. And I think because, you know, because, you know, as part of Vietnamese culture, there's a lot of stigma against traumatized people. As I wrote in the book, you know, the traumatized are considered possessed by ghosts, you know. So the traumatized normally are not willing to share experiences. So that is very difficult for us to heal. So healing needs communalizing our experiences. And by talking about it, we help each other heal. So by asking our parents questions, we make them feel less alone, and if we can understand their experiences, we can carry their stories forward. So I wrote this novel with the hope that I myself would have more dialogues with my parents, and I hope, you know, the younger readers will keep talking to their parents and their grandparents. I think that a tendency is that as our society develops, we leave elder people behind, you know. We don't talk to them as often anymore, and they have so much wisdom and so many lessons to share with us.
Yeah, I think it's one of the most sort of salient features of your novel. I mean, at the core of it is this ongoing conversation between Diệu Lan and Huong, you know, and you see Huong as a person change as a result of those conversations, and you know, the story is about Huong, but as you say, Ian and I talked a bit about this, you know, it's a story about her as she changes in response to the stories that her grandmother tells her. So the sort of focus is not on her, and yet it is a story about her. So I thought that was really finely crafted, and it's a kind of example, as you say, of what perhaps we should be doing, you know, all the time. It's really nice.
I was thinking how sometimes you're so economical about the way you do these things. To recount an experience I had as a child. I grew up in rural Minnesota. It's all white. So it's just a very, people consider it to be very MAGA homeland because it's all white people. My parents were undocumented immigrants. That's why I ended up there. My dad was a doctor. So I was in elementary school when we had two quote unquote boat people, Van and Fan, and they just kind of shoved them in our class, and they literally said, "These are boat people, bye. And Marie will take care of them because she's also clearly Asian." I think my father actually had like a dictionary. So we were able to actually point to some Chinese characters, and we were able to speak a little bit, but then, 2 days later, they were just gone. And so you only did like a couple sentences, but it was just so wonderful how that it kind of like explained everything without being didactic, like that experience for me and everyone in my class, because they were just like, here are these kids, they're boat people. So what are you supposed to make from that? There are people, boats. Do you know what I'm saying? And so I just thought, this is such the power of fiction that you could kind of fold all of this in and illuminate this experience. And then I kind of actually, I'm thinking about being a kid again. I want to pivot a little bit, but one question I've been dying to ask you. So in Hung learns English because she reads like Snow White, and I'm sort of like, where do those little house books come from? I'm so curious. She's reading these kind of like classic things that we American kids would read.
Yeah, I think Hung's love for reading is inspired by my own experiences growing up in Vietnam. And, my parents were both teachers and farmers. So we had so little money because their salary was, was so little. So we had to do so many things to be able to make ends meet. But they always invested in books. So the most valuable possession we had in our house was a bookshelf that my father built by himself. So I read until the covers fell off because we didn't have so many books, and I had no access to a bookstore or a library. So whomever visited my family, I asked whether I could borrow books from them. So I asked all of my parents' friends. The story of little house in the big wood is inspired by a story that Larry Heinemann told me. So Larry Heinemann is an American veteran who fought during the Vietnam War and who wrote the novel Paco Story, which won the National Book Award. So he wrote an essay which I translated into Vietnamese. He said that, during his time in Vietnam as a soldier, he knew nothing about Vietnamese literature and Vietnamese culture because he was told that, Vietnam didn't have any culture and the Vietnamese were dehumanized for people like him. But after the war, he met a professor who went to Russia. His only task was to translate, was to learn English and translate American literature to read, to understand the hearts and mind of American people, to help the army defeat the Americans. So he went back to Vietnam. He traveled from north to south through the Trường Sơn Mountains together with troops. He would talk about American literatures with Vietnamese soldiers, so they would know more about Americans to know how to defeat them. So that essay gave me the idea of Hương reading American books translated by this professor. So I made up this story, using Larry's, experience. So yeah, but I think, Hương said in the novel, if everyone reads each other and see the light of each other's culture, there would be no war on earth. And I believe this is true. I think in any war, we dehumanize the other people. And I think if we appreciate each other more, there would be more peace on earth.
I just want to quickly remind you, because I was so swept up in the conversation, I did not make a formal announcement, but we are in the Q&A. So please do go ahead and use the Q&A function if you like. And in the meanwhile, I did want a question I have been dying to ask is a little bit more. I don't know. It feels very much like there are an engagement with a variety of Vietnamese literature in your story, particularly the protagonist, like Huong as a writer. It's such a recognized. I mean, there's so many writer heroes in Vietnamese literature, you know, and you can almost see the little shelf with the tattered books, you know, in her little apartment, you know. The protagonist, particularly of Bi Kịch Nhỏ, the Lê Minh Khuê's novel, and the protagonist on the other end of the 20th century, the earlier end, of Song Mon, you know, the writer who eventually joins the revolution. In some ways, both of those writers are dispirited, you know, and yet Huong is the opposite of that. So I guess I'm asking two questions. One, which pieces of literature did you have in mind, if any, when you were constructing the story? Because it seems to speak so across so many pieces of literature. And two, like, can you talk a little bit about Huong as a protagonist writer who, in fact, is not a dispirited? I mean, so often that character ends up cynical, you know, in Vietnamese literature. So can you talk a little bit about the distinctiveness of Huong as in this sort of gathering of writer protagonists in Vietnamese literature?
You know, so when I always, you know, growing up, I read epic novels composed in poetry, like the Tale of Kiều or the Tale of Phạm Công Cúc Hoa. You know, these are books written entirely in poetry, and I dreamed that one day I would be able to write an epic novel in the poetic language like that. So, but you know, it was my mission to write in women's points of view, because you know, even the word history, you know, his story, there's no her story, you know. So stories from women have been erased or brushed aside throughout history. And I feel like I had to reclaim the space to tell our own stories, you know. So I was determined to tell women's stories, you know, stories about their family. And I wanted to tell the stories of ordinary Vietnamese women, because they are the witness of history, and they hold so much from inside of them. You know, I was talking to a lot of elderly people throughout my years living in Vietnam, and I fear that when these women pass away because of their own old age, their history will be forgotten. History witnessed by them will be forgotten. So I felt a responsibility to document these narratives somehow through a fictional account. Yeah. So I mean, I don't know. I think you know, I wanted to create something unique as well, and I wanted to include my personal experiences. You know, as a child, I wanted to be a writer because, you know, I love to read and I love to escape through books. So I was told, so many people told me no, and I did not return to my writing dream when I was 33 years old. And I always wanted to write with honesty, you know. So one reason I wanted to include a young character into a novel set against the war is that for someone who hasn't experienced war, they don't know the full extent of how horrible it is. So, you know, for a person to confront the horror of war, the atrocity of war, the person is really innocent like a child. And, you know, like a child, overnight, you experience war and you have no choice but to grow up really fast. You become an adult. You have to bear responsibility. You inherit trauma. You have to help other people, and you have to survive. So, you know, seeing the war through Huong's perspective, I think is really important to me as a person and as a writer, because I want to show how the war really affected human beings.
That's fascinating. I'm sorry to jump in again, but I just want to say, because that was an experience I had reading the first 50 or so pages of the novel. You know, something was happening in my response to it. And then I realized, oh, it's Hương, like you're seeing Hanoi, you're seeing these things through Hương life. And then as the world darkens, you know, you realize that you're standing next to Hương as the world darkens and complexifies. So it was really finely crafted. I do want to jump, unless a panelist has a question, to a question from the audience, because it's been posed one or two different ways. And it's a bit of a pivot, but a couple of times the audience and anonymous audience members have asked if you have any plans to actually issue a full translation of the novel or a modified translation of the novel into Vietnamese.
Oh, thank you, thank you. Actually, because I'm a literary translator, so I planned to translate this novel myself into English. But I have been so busy with finishing my second novel, so I have some good news to share. My second novel, Dust Child, will be published on the 14th of March, 2023. So I've been busy working with that. It has taken me quite some years. So there is a reader in Hanoi who's a professional translator. She contacted me after reading the book and she said, I want to translate this book for free. Nobody has to pay me because Vietnamese needs to read this novel. So she translated a few chapters. So I have been looking at it and editing it. Maybe I will work with her. I don't know yet, but I feel like, you know, maybe I should write the next novel instead of translating this one. Maybe I should entrust the task to a professional, you know, translator. There are several publishers who wrote to me and who want to buy the Vietnamese rights. So I hope it can be published soon.
Thank you. Do you plan, you know, Dust Child is also in English, I assume, right? So do you plan to go back and write fresh novels in Vietnamese, or are you staying in the English medium, or have you thought about, you know, that question in general?
I write in Vietnamese all the time. At the moment, I'm completing a book in Vietnamese language, and I also write a lot of, I have a column on a Vietnamese national newspaper. When I write my opinion about different social issues. So I do write in Vietnamese. But I mean, I'm working on different manuscripts at the same time. So my next manuscript will be, so after Dust Child will be full-length poetry collection in English. So every time, with every project, I want to challenge myself. So with Dust Child, I have done a most crazy task. I have 4 narrators in the novel, and one of whom is a traumatized American veteran who flew helicopters during the Vietnam War. So to begin with, I did not know anything about helicopters, so I had to learn a lot about helicopters and to be able to write his character. But I think, you know, with the harder the challenge, the more you learn. So I learned a lot through writing this book in the viewpoint of a Black American, of 2 women who worked in who worked in the bars in Saigon during the war to serve American men. And I want to write against the Kim image in, you know, the popular Miss Saigon. You know, I want to give the full agency and complexity to Vietnamese women who had to work as prostitutes during the Vietnam War. And I want to show how the American military, you know, destroyed our culture, the fabric of our society with their presence as well. So, you know, so the next project after Dust Child is a poetry collection in English. It's crazy that I'm writing poetry in English, but I have practiced it through my novel. So hopefully I will find a good publisher for it.
Yeah, I have to echo Marie's comment earlier in the conversation about this exact point, because you have a lyricism in English. It's remarkable how, well, I mean, poetry is so intimately associated with the language that it's written in, you know. It's so locked into that because there is not that narrative scaffolding, you know, so it's remarkable to hear, you know, that you're taking that challenge on. Your comments just now did also actually begin to answer one of our attendees' questions as well, who asks in general, what the process of writing Dust Child, how it differs from your process in writing The Mountain Sing. And I would like to tack on to that, like specifically with regard to the English medium. Like, do you find it different now that you've written an entire novel in English?
I think it was a bit easier for me to write this second novel in English, because I think by now my English is better, and my editor said I have reached a higher level in terms of complexity. So I don't know, but each work of I love Ocean Vuong. You all need to read his novel On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous, and his new collection Time is a Mother. And Ocean said, every time you begin a new book, you are a beginner. You start with a blank page, and for me it's the same. I'm not I don't know how Marie writes her novel. Do you plan ahead? For me, I don't plan. I started and I just write. I let my imagination and my characters take me. At least for the first draft, I discover a lot of surprises, and I love that, because I feel like when I'm surprised, the readers will be surprised too. So Mary, do you plan when you write your novel?
And Henry James said the world of fiction has one door but many windows. So I end up like going through every window to figure out which is the right one. And I was actually trained as an undergraduate as an economist. So in economics, you should get better every time. So every time I agree, I don't know what I'm doing. And I actually feel some resentment towards myself, because does experience not matter? Every book, every work is its new thing. I completely agree with you. And that's some of the fun part, but it's also a lot of the frustrating part, why it takes us so long to write something, because we don't know where it's going to go.
Mm-hmm.
It's so funny.
So we have just 1 minute left. I want to reserve it for our two discussants, Yến Vũ and Marie, for any last remarks or questions you'd like to pose to Quế Mai.
No questions, but a lot of you mentioned all of my questions actually. And I think that, like I said in the beginning, it's just a testament to how well this book was crafted and written. And I have two comments. One on something that Ocean Vuong also said in an interview about language and how it allows us to lift the veil so that we can really see each other. And I think that's something that you do here and you try to do with Vietnamese history. And one of the analogies you use in the very beginning is about the mountain and how the struggles of the Vietnamese people are as tall as mountains, but you have to step back. You have to step back so that you can appreciate the beauty of it. And I think in some ways, this book it allows us to step back from just the purview of the Vietnam War and the refugee experience, which is mostly represented in the English language, but stepping back and including the Great Famine, including these other moments in Vietnamese history that led up to the Vietnam War, so that the Vietnam War is just not this independent moment, but is deeply rooted in these other moments of Vietnamese history that make the Vietnamese experience that much more interesting and important to better understand.
So I have a little bit of a weird comment that's just come to me now after this whole discussion. I was actually doing a nonfiction piece about with the Defense Department, how they're trying to do these stuff with brainwaves to create super soldiers. So talking about the contemporariness of this book, one of the people from the National Security Agency asked me what I did. And I said, I'm a novelist. And he's like, ugh, novels. And I'm like, oh, normally people are kind of impressed when I say I'm a novelist. And he said, no, we're not allowed to read fiction at the NSA because fiction creates empathy. So I'm going, okay, what? And then he's like, no, because it opens you up to spies and stuff like that. So I love this idea of making sure everybody gives this novel to someone who doesn't normally read, because they'll just get sucked into it and they'll involuntarily learn all this stuff and have empathy and just, so that's my secret idea, because I do feel I didn't, because when you're a writer and we're academics, everyone loves to read, but then you realize actually in the larger culture, it's not just the NSA and the CIA. Do you see what I'm saying? Like, I feel like there is this resistance for a lot of people to be like, oh, why should I waste my time on something that's made up? Or particularly with ethnic literature, I find that, well, she just wrote down what her grandma told her, so why should I care? As opposed to like, you interviewed thousands of people and did all this research and, you know, did all this stuff on the ground to create this work that is so powerful, and but also like, you know, in parlance of book, it's very readable. So that's my secret idea, because I'm really sad you didn't win the Dayton Peace Prize. I think this would have been a perfect book for that. And yes, and so I'm just expressing my undying admiration that a book can do so much in one book. And so I just want to thank everyone for bringing this together, because this is just an amazing discussion.
Thank you so much. So Quế Mai, we'll reserve the last word for you, our guest of honor, if you'd like to make any final remarks in response to anything.
I just want to thank everybody for joining us today. We can't see your faces, but I feel your presence. Thank you so much for being here with us and for listening until the very end. It has been my honor to be speaking with John, with Ian, and with Marie. I have learned a lot from you today, and I appreciate your time and your support so much. Ian, I'm so excited you are joining Fulbright University in Vietnam. I'm actually, doing a presentation. I'm giving an event at Fulbright next week, so I'll be there. I'll be talking about you. Marie, thank you so much for sharing your precious time with me today. I can't wait for the publication of your novel. Everyone out there, check out The Evening Hero. It's an amazing novel. And Marie, I wish you a lot of fun, with the publication of your book. And I have no doubt it will be successful. Julie and John, thank you so much for all your time, for the hard work you have done to make this event possible. Thank you so much, everyone. I really appreciate your time and your presence today. Thank you.
Thanks to all of our speakers, and especially to Quế Mai. Thank you so much.
Thank you.